All right, then let's get started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music's free, virtual, and very informal monthly series, Conversations with Our Curator. I am Melissa Kozlowski, the Director of Curatorial Affairs for the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music, and I am so excited to welcome you. We've been doing this program for like 2.5 years now, and we are just so excited that we can bring this content, these wonderful books, these wonderful authors to you literally across the globe. I was just saying, we've got folks joining from Norway, from Australia, who knows where else. And they're here because they are very excited to chat with Peter Ames Carlin. We are here tonight to discuss Peter's 2025 book, Tonight in Jungleland, The Making of Born to Run. Peter is a writer and author of several books, including Homeward Bound, The Life of Paul Simon, and Bruce, a biography of Bruce Springsteen, published in October of 2012. Peter's also been a freelance journalist, a senior writer at People in New York City, a television columnist, and a guest at some of our events at the center. So you are really in for a treat this evening. But before we dive into chatting with Peter, our regulars know that I have to give a little center infomercial first. If you're not overly familiar with the center, we are located at Monmouth University, straddling the border of West Long Branch and Long Branch, New Jersey. We are just about a mile from the beach and just up the road from famed Asbury Park. We are also just a couple blocks from the tiny house where Bruce wrote most of Born to Run, so especially fitting for tonight's book. Now, we at the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music preserve Bruce's legacy. We are his official repository, but we also seek to tell broad stories about American life, history, and culture through the really accessible prism of music. So, if you come see us at our brand new home on the Jersey Shore, you will come into our 30,000 square foot facility. You will see about 10,000 square feet of exhibits, and they cover American music broadly in addition to Bruce and the E Street Band. So you can plan your visit by checking out our website, which is springsteencenter.org. We are a 501(c)(3), so you can also donate via the website if you are so inclined. Thanks for letting us introduce us to you a little bit. We'll get back to tonight's program. So again, Conversations with Our Curator is this free monthly series that features researchers and writers who are exploring new perspectives in American music history. I will initially ask Peter some questions, and then we'll get to the best part, which is you get to ask Peter some questions. So if you could just make sure that you stay muted until that point, we would appreciate it. All right, I'm done. I kept that very brief, right? Peter, are you ready to get going? Oh, Peter's the power of mute got to Peter when I was muting the rest of you. So Peter's got to go ahead and unmute.
I think I unmuted now.
There we go. Thank you so much. All right, so we're here because we're celebrating, right? It's the 1 year anniversary of your book.
Yeah, right.
Does
Everyone
that
is
seem
celebrating that.
crazy? Does that seem crazy that a year's gone by already?
Sure, but time flies, right? So it's just like, yes, on one level, it does seem like, wow, that seemed like that just happened the other day. But on the other hand, there's been a lot of action between then and now.
So, obviously, as I just read in your brief bio, which only scratched the surface of your body of work, but you've written about Bruce before. So,
Mhm.
why did you want to return to him, and why specifically for the 50th anniversary of Born to Run?
It seemed like a really important part of his story that I really only had a chance to touch on kind of lightly in the original in Bruce, the biography. that you mentioned. And I was actually when I got the idea to do this, I was under the impression that I had tons of leftover material on Born to Run that were in my notes and archives and stuff. And so I set up the deal to do the book and everything, and it was going to be on a really tight deadline. And I thought, well, that won't be that big a problem because I've got all this stuff in my archive. And then when I dug into everything, it was like, oh my God, there really isn't, it's like there was so much stuff to cover in doing Bruce's whole life story between 1949 and 2012 that I had to kind of bust through Born to Run pretty quickly. And then as it obviously that's such a significant turning point for Bruce and his career that once I got into it, it was like, yeah, there's just a wealth of stuff here that I haven't really had a chance to dive into. And obviously, I mean, it was the album on which he really kind of figured out who he was as an artist and how he was going to take all these different influences and impulses that he had and really crystallize them and turn them, and sort of create the voice and the character that was going to, see him through from that point to now. Obviously, he's grown and changed as everyone does over the years, but that there's still very much, the essence of the guy on the, in Born to Run that continues through his work to this day. And, and once I started really getting a chance to talk to Bruce specifically about the period of time when he was writing and recording Born to Run, what was clear was the depth of his emotional connection to it, to this day. So, it was just a very rich moment in his career and super, super fun and engaging to really dive in.
Now, I'm always trying to be cognizant of the fact that whenever we at the center do an event, there are some super fans who know every detail of every story, but there are also some more casual fans. So you just referenced Born to Run being a turning point. Can you just walk everybody through quickly how the first two albums come out in 1973? They are not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily selling like hotcakes, and this is a make or break moment for Bruce.
Yeah, so he signed with Columbia in mid 72, and then they got to work and recorded Greetings from Asbury Park, which came out in January of 73, with a lot of publicity. The label president, Clive Davis, was super into Bruce and really got behind him. And so, the label itself really sort of got together to try to sell it, and it just didn't go anywhere. I mean, there wasn't stuff on. I mean, there's a lot of great stuff on that record, but none of it was particularly attuned toward what was happening on the radio at the time. And so the record came out. It got really good reviews. It sold maybe 20,000 copies, not a lot. Didn't get on the radio most places. They continued to, the Bruce and the band, were touring around the Northeast and just trying to kind of get a foothold of a of the audience, and then very quickly turned around and wrote and recorded The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle, which came out I think in November of 73. But by the time that came out, Clive Davis had been fired at Columbia. There was a new administration, and they came in, and they didn't necessarily have anything against Bruce, but they also didn't have any real strong connection to him. And the people who had sort of ascended in the A&R department and were making these decisions about which artists were going to stay on the label and which ones they were going to let go and which ones they were going to keep, but maybe just not put so much emphasis on, were not all that enamored of Bruce and his early work. And at one point, the guy who was the head of A&R Charlie Koppelman called Bruce in after hearing Wild the Innocent and said, listen, like there's a lot of good songs on here, but I think we should re-record this like with studio pros in our studio and really make it kind of sleek, and we can get some of these songs on the radio. And Bruce's response was, nope, that's not happening. Like, these are my songs. That's my band. This is my sound. And the guy was like, okay, I mean, that's obviously a decision you can make, but just don't expect us to sell this record for you. And they didn't. But still, another wave of great reviews. But the record again sold maybe 20,000 copies. It was not, really doing the job for him in terms of building an audience. And at that point, there was a real sense that maybe the label was going to drop him, just, cut bait and move on with other artists that felt like, they had more potential. But Bruce kept working. He had this core of fans that was getting bigger and bigger, and also a core of fans at the label who were like lower level type employees, but they had this level of, this sort of ferocious loyalty to Bruce and this evangelical sense of like, we have got to break this guy. And those guys did a really good job of keeping, some fires lit at the label, and enough to get him to a point where when Mike Appel went to Columbia and said, well, we want to start working on the third record, they said, well, tell you what, why don't you make a single? And if that single sounds like it could possibly get on the radio, then we'll give you the rest of the money to make the third album. And so, Bruce kind of repeatedly, especially in this part of his career, sort of had this experience of being, having his back against the wall, with no tomorrow. It's like do or die. So he and Mike set out to write and record, Bruce wrote, and then they set out to record Born to Run, and spent months and months and months on it, on the single itself, just the song, and finished it by August of '74, and gave it to the record company, who were sort of lukewarm on it. But there was a lot of other stuff going on at the same time. John Landau published his big essay that was in the Real Paper was not the Real Paper, in the Phoenix in Boston, that had the very famous line, I've seen rock and roll future and its name is Bruce Springsteen. And he was such a big deal and so powerful in music journalism, being the record reviews editor at Rolling Stone, among other things at the time, that kind of got Columbia's attention. And they said, okay, we'll give you the money to make the third record. And so Bruce and everybody got to work on it. And it was, this laborious process, and eventually the record came out in August of '75, and it was such a, obviously we've all heard Born to Run. It's such a powerful expression of Bruce's music and aesthetic, and his sort of, that voice that he was really trying to put together. It just got a mammoth amount of attention, and, acres and acres of coverage, and what you might call hype, which was a mixed blessing. But of course, from that point forward, Bruce really broke through and kind of became, what you would call a rock star.
Give the folks a little context. You've noted that Greetings and Wild and Innocent don't sound like what's on the radio at the time, right? And that was of concern
Mm-hmm.
to the record company. So, what was a radio friendly hit at the time? Give us that context.
Oh, well, golly, what was big in the early '70s? I mean, it was the time of like Cat Stevens and or not Harry Chapin, excuse me, Jim Croce, James Taylor, a lot of singer-songwriters, but their sound was very, like a lot of the stuff coming out of Warner Brothers in Burbank in California. So you had, like Gordon Lightfoot, and, Dylan was still everywhere, but he was sort of an exception to the rule. A lot of the stuff that was turning up on AM radio at the time was just very, there was a kind of a post '60s sort of emphasis on sort of pop conviviality.
Mhm.
Um, and there was a lot of great music on the airwaves at the time, and a lot of great R&B music, the beginnings of disco, which was exciting, and obviously the beginning of punk rock, though, that wasn't anywhere near the radio at the time. But there was just a kind of, I want to say sleekness, a kind of easygoing quality. Chicago was huge, remember? And so when you take a song like, does anybody really know what time it is? Or ooh, baby, it's a wide world, and then you spin that and then spin uh, um, Spirit in the Night or something. It just doesn't quite sound, and Bruce has got that very distinctive and rough-hewn voice, which really didn't mesh on the radio at the time. And so he was just kind of out of the mainstream. And by the time, and Born to Run, the song itself didn't sound a lot like stuff that was on the radio in 1975, but it was so powerful. Certain songs, certain artists have the power to bend the mainstream back to them. And that's what happened when Born to Run came out. But the stuff, because it's just overpowering when you hear it, as opposed to the earlier stuff, which is a little more, it's just a little sneakier, and it's just a lot of the stuff that we came to associate with Bruce, and like his guitar playing and the hard sort of rock sound was not on those first couple records.
So we've set the stage as he's writing Born to Run. How much of the album, in your opinion, is driven by his personal vision versus this fear that he might not get another chance if he doesn't get it right?
Well, that is his personal vision. It's like all those things are inextricable, I mean, so it's this sense of desperation that he felt about his own position and what was going to happen in his life was very much associated with a sort of a larger desperation that was happening, in terms of like, what he had seen in Freehold and Asbury Park among his, very working class group of friends and family. I mean, people had been, as they say, working really hard and playing by the rules for a long time. And by the early 70s, the mid 70s, they were just, it was still possible to get completely run over by society despite that. Or, if you were a kid, an ambitious kid growing up in Freehold, you were not really, and and you were a working class kid, but you wanted to establish yourself in a way that had, that wasn't bound in by the limitations of living in a small blue collar town. That was tough, and it was really hard to figure out, well, how am I going to become myself? Which is what Bruce was trying to do as a musician, but so many people that he grew up with were trying to do just as people. And, the thing he kept coming back to as he was writing Born to Run was this idea of you just get out of town, you hit the road. And no matter where you think you're going, or if you get to that specific place, the act of just jumping in your car and leaving is so powerful and so transformative that it really, you'll notice on Born to Run, all those songs, about as specific as he gets is in Born, the song itself in Born to Run, where he says, we'll get to that place where we really want to go and we'll walk in the sun, which does not narrow it down. It could be anywhere, it could be, I mean, it could be Atlantic City. I mean, or it could be anywhere really. So but that's not the point. The point is the journey.
Besides Bruce, who do you think are some of the figures most critical to the album's success?
Well, definitely Mike Appel, definitely John Landau, and definitely the guys, the members of the E Street Band. I mean, and I think particularly it's such a piano-driven record because Bruce wrote so many of those songs on that little spinet piano he had in his house there. So Roy Bittan was huge. I mean, the parts that he plays are so powerful and so definitive for those songs. I mean, there was kind of, it almost spurred a crisis because when Bruce was trying to add guitar to Thunder Road, it's like, where does it even go? And that's a song that includes that line, well, I got this guitar and I learned how to make it talk, but it didn't, but he was having a hard time figuring out what his guitar should say in that song. And it was kind of a little, an existential moment for a guy who had really had long since concluded that that guitars and rock and roll, guitars were the heart of rock and roll, and his guitar in particular. So all those guys, and then of course there are the fans and supporters he had at Columbia were, a lot of those guys stepped up big too, just to make sure he got the opportunity to make that record. So it's like, with so many projects like that, it kind of takes a village for the thing to really come together. And but those guys, I mean, and Mike Appel got kind of, obviously there was the big lawsuit and 10 or so years of conflict that happened as a result, and none of that was pleasant. And you could argue that maybe Mike wasn't the guy that was going to help him get beyond Born to Run. But oh my God, his role in getting to Born to Run and then making Born to Run, and just the fact that when you think that when Bruce said he wanted John Landau to come in as a co-producer, I think virtually every other manager, producer, you know, business guy who's in as deep as Mike was with Bruce would have said, no, it's just the two of us. We're good. We don't need another guy. But the fact that he was willing to say, if that's what you think you need, then that's what we should do, was huge, and his trust in Bruce, his faith in Bruce, and his willingness to do whatever Bruce wanted to do was vast. I mean, so it's like, you just can't underestimate, or excuse me, you can't overestimate the importance of that. And of course, John gave Bruce a whole other vocabulary, and I think helped him really connect with his intellectual side and help him sort of deepen the voice and find new depth as a writer. So, I think both of those guys, both of the co-producers, were immense.
The making of the album was a notoriously painstaking process. When we did the 50th anniversary symposium at Monmouth University, we were doing just silly little social media filming, back of house. And we would ask the folks, if you had to describe the making of the album in one word, what would it be? And I'm paraphrasing off the top of my head, but it was like exhausting, awful, gut-wrenching. So talk to us a little bit about why the making of the album was such a painstaking, exhaustive process.
Well, I think that I mean, a variety of things that sort of show Bruce at his best and at his worst at the same time. I mean, he was going to make certain that every single note and every single syllable of everything that showed up, and every single silent moment was going to sound and be exactly what he wanted it to be. And it was a life or death proposition for him in that moment in his head, because he thought, if this doesn't work, then I go home and I'm just a guy that plays in a bar. Like that was his emotional reality at the time. I mean, that's ridiculous. It was never going to work out like that. But you could see why Bruce at 25 years old would feel like he had had his shot, and it seemed like maybe he had blown it. And this was it. This was like the last chance to really make it work. And so he just couldn't, he just had to sweat every single molecule that went into that. But a part of, and a lot of that was dependent on other people having, being devoted to him and his vision. And he would just test people and just push them to their limit and then beyond. And if you weren't, and he made it very clear that if you weren't there to do exactly what was needed in the specific moment that it was needed, that he was gonna it was gonna be rough for you. And Bruce was going to make it very, very rough. And I think that he's, he said, admitted as much talking to me. It was just like, yeah, that was kind of messed up, but that's who I was at the time. It was like Stephen Appel, Mike's little brother, who did a lot of work with Bruce on the road and was a big part of making sure things were running smoothly in the studio, said, Bruce was like a psychopath. And then he would put you through these sessions where he would play two notes for like 8 hours over and over again in slightly different ways with slightly different effects and slightly different amounts of echo or whatever. And he goes, and eventually you become the psychopath because you're there trying to figure out, how can I help this guy? And he keeps moving the goalposts. But I think that was part of his kind of, his journey to of creation. It's like, I don't think any birth process is neat and painless. And that was a big part of his ongoing creative birth and his evolving into the adult artist he needed to be. But first he had to figure out what that was. And it wasn't easy for him, and he made sure it wasn't easy for anyone else either.
But of course, it pays off, right? So the album comes out. It is the success it needs to be, perhaps exemplified by the simultaneous Time and Newsweek covers in October of 75. Um, how do you think the hype that surrounds the album impacts Bruce?
That freaks him out, but I think part of the reason, and he sort of reacts badly at certain moments. But on the other hand, I think at the time there was this kind of this ethic of this sort of post Woodstock ethic that you shouldn't want to be successful, and you shouldn't really want to try to sell your work or draw attention to it. Though of course, there's this paradoxical thing where people would get attention by proclaiming how much they didn't want to get attention. And if going back to like the earliest interviews Bruce gave when Greetings came out, he says all this alarmingly bullshit stuff about how, like, yeah, I didn't want to sign to a record label anyway. They kind of forced me into it, and it was like pulling teeth getting me to sign the contract, which is absolutely not true. Completely not true. But in that moment, the idea, in this, especially for somebody who is being called like a new Dylan, you have all this, there's all this pressure to not just be, a rock star or a musician or a singer songwriter, but you also kind of have to be like like a spiritual leader of sorts. And you have to kind of channel the sort of generational, sort of countercultural sort of message, which is a kind of a heavy weight to put on somebody, especially in their early 20s. And I think on the one hand, it's like, we're going to focus all this attention on you. But on the other hand, you're supposed to hate the attention, even though everything you're doing is designed to get the attention. Just because you want to draw, and not because it's like, aha, that's how I'm going to make a lot of money, or it's so important to me to be on the cover of all these magazines. But I think it was just because you want the work to get attention. You spend all this time writing and creating this art. It's like, of course you want people to listen to it. And of course you're going to do the stuff they ask you to do, or as much of it as you can tolerate, in order to draw attention to the thing. And so he was sort of strung between his sort of competing impulses. One, to be the staunchly uncompromising artist who didn't give a shit about being famous. And the other was the guy that really wanted his art to be famous, or at least to be heard and known and to make an impact on people. And so, without necessarily turning himself into some fetishized celebrity, even though that's obviously becomes a part of it. So, he was very much at odds with himself. He had such a huge, kind of had a hissy fit when the Time and Newsweek covers came out. But as he said later, he goes, I didn't have to do those interviews. Like, I knew exactly what I was doing. It's just that occasionally I wouldn't, I wasn't certain if it had been a good idea. So, and also he's a kid at the time. I mean, he was 20, I think by that point, 26, which is incredibly young. I, I hate to think about how I would respond if I had even like the minuscule amount of attention I get, for my work today. If that had happened to me when I was 26 or 25 years old, I mean, it would have been, I hate to think.
Hmm. So, how then does that experience, that attention, shape Bruce as an artist who then goes on to have a career for many more decades?
I think he figured out how to do it. I mean, you go through the ringer a time or two, and you become, you're aware of how it works, and what's going to, get a sense of what's going to happen, and how you can maybe control it a little bit, or at least how you can try to channel it. I mean, what's always fascinating to me is that, in his first few major successes, like with commercial successes, like The River in 1980. Obviously, Born to Run was a big success, but then The River was even bigger, and he had like a top 10 single with Hungry Heart. So suddenly, you go even after Born to Run, they're still playing theaters around most of the country, except for like Philadelphia and New York and these places where they were kind of huge because they had been playing a lot. But when they came out west to Seattle, and there I think the Seattle's Paramount Theater was sold out for the Born to Run tour. But when they went down to Portland the next night to play the Paramount down there, it was like half full. And that was because they weren't on the radio in Portland yet, but they were on the radio in Seattle, which is why everybody was at the show. So it's like it was kind of city to city, and that continued through the Darkness tour. There were certain parts of the country they hadn't played and they weren't known, and they'd go there and run out onto the stage, and there would barely be anybody out there. But they, Bruce being Bruce and the band being who they are, they were just like, okay, screw it. We're just going to play the best show we can possibly play and throw ourselves into it. And that's how eventually how they built the part of how they built the mammoth audience that they would soon claim. But I think every time he's had those big bursts of fame, and then again, obviously, even most massively with Born in the USA, his impulse after the big success is to pull back a little bit. After The River, he made Nebraska. After Born in the USA, the next studio record he made was Tunnel of Love, which was designed specific. I mean, it was still a huge hit and had a few big singles and lots of videos and got a lot of attention, but it definitely was not the Bruce of Born in the USA. So I think, we again see his sort of paradoxical attitude about, fame, and how well known he really wants to be. Though, clearly, as time goes by, he got a lot more experienced and more comfortable with, the job of being a rock star.
Mm. I'll ask one more question, then I want to make sure I reserve time for our audience. You'd written about Bruce before. As you were working on this book, were there any particular treasure troves of sources that revealed themselves that you'd not seen before? New source
Um,
material for your research.
you mean paper, like documents
Either
and like,
archival documents, or you could talk about the
yeah,
new interviews that you did.
right. Um, Well, I mean, I spoke to most everyone I spoke to were people I talked to for the biography, but it's just that we hadn't talked about Born to Run in such detail. And so once all that stuff, once it was like, okay, this interview is entirely about things that happened within the course of about 18 months. And so people, you could really focus in and really get a kind of a kind of a granular sense of what their lives were like. And it was interesting to me in the beginning of the book, there's this whole description. There's a few chapters that gets into the touring that they were doing in 74 and the first part of 75. And they were just on the road constantly. And it was not like easy touring. They're just driving from place to place and through snowstorms and through terrible summer weather. And just every night, they're somewhere, they're playing a different show somewhere else. And so it was interesting to get those perspectives. There were a few people I hadn't really I didn't talk to Davey Sanchez before the biography for some reason that I can't remember now. But we had a good talk, and that was great. And I'm trying to think if there was anyone else who I hadn't really spoken to, but I think really, I spoke to Jimmy Iovine too, which was great. I hadn't talked to him for the biography, but he came up big for this book. So that was really interesting. He's always got a lot to say. So, and, so it was, I mean, it wasn't like shocking. It wasn't like I opened up a box or talked to someone who completely changed swiveled my head around, but it just was a question of like, oh, yeah, when you really look at this, and really focus in, more interesting stuff kind of comes floating to the surface.
All right. Well, as I promised, we want to make sure we reserve some time for audience Q&A. Ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome to unmute yourself and just shout out your question or type it in the chat, and I would be happy to read it for you. So
I have a
let
question.
me, sure, go ahead.
Uh, how do you do? You mentioned that CBS in this third album, in Born to Run, that they allowed Bruce to do what he wanted to do and make the kind of album, pick the music, uh, pick every note, right?
Hmm.
Arrange everything. He did not have that control on the first two albums.
Oh no, he totally did. I mean,
Mhm.
that was kind of part of the deal that he had made in 1972 was, keeping creative control. And at that point, and so but the thing is that they didn't, like, for instance, when they released Wild and the Innocent, and the guy Charlie Koppelman didn't like compel him to re-record that album. He just wanted him to. And Bruce said, "Well, thanks for your input, but that's not going to happen." But then he said, okay, well, then we're just not really going to be able to put a lot of muscle into promoting it. And he fulfilled that part of the promise. So, it was just the terms of the deal that he had. And I guess, just the ethic of the label at the time, which was, well, if we have an artist who's a real serious artist, we're going to let that person make the record that they feel like making. I mean, and that was how Warner Brothers was so successful in the late 60s and early 70s. And one of the real revolutionary things they did was give all their artists that kind of creative control. And we're very upfront about it. It's like we never tell anyone what they should do. We may have suggestions, but ultimately they're the artist and it's their art. So, but again, it's that bit of a thing where, you're either going to put your corporate muscle into selling the thing, or you're going to focus on somebody else whose work you know, seems like it might be more promising commercially. So that was
Yeah,
kind of
because
that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
because when Born to Run came out, as good as it was and as exciting as it was, and of course the single was out well before the album came out. I was always kind of disappointed, wasn't it?
Well, it was,
WNEW was playing it in the
it had
summer.
been leaked. Mike
Yeah.
Appel dubbed off a bunch of copies and sent them to supportive DJs.
And so what I was disappointed in was that it was going in a different direction than the first two albums. So I kind of disagree with you as far as his guitar playing, because
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to hear a better intro than Kitty's Back.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
sure. But on the first
and
record, there's only one song with an electric guitar on it, on All of Greetings, and it's
wow, I didn't realize that.
Blinded by the Light. Yeah. So it's like they really were de-emphasizing the guitars on certainly on the first one. The second record is much more obvious. I mean, Kitty's Back is like, to this day, I think it is the most like lead guitar that Bruce has ever, he has ever played. But that
And
was very specifically a band album.
Hmm.
yeah, but it's certainly an answer to the people who underestimate his guitar playing, because he
Hmm.
was
Mm-hmm.
the best guitar player out of all those guys who were playing down here. He was always acknowledged as the best guitar player
Mm-hmm.
in the Jersey Shore area of all
Yeah,
the great people who were there. Anyway, thank you.
you bet.
Thanks for your question, Prosper. Here's a question in the chat from David, who saw the Born to Run tour at Duke University in 1976. Peter, can you speak a bit to the story behind Ernest and David leaving the band, and was their departure amicable?
Oh yeah, it was amicable. I mean, what happened was when Bruce was pulling together the E Street Band in the fall of '72, Davey and was in a like a jazz fusion trio with Boom and Gary Talent. And when Bruce called, those two guys decided they wanted to keep doing the jazz thing, and then Gary obviously came back to New Jersey and joined up with the E Street Band. And then, it took 6 or 7 months or so for Davey to decide that he wanted to come join the band as well. So then he joined the E Street Band in the spring of '73. But they still had these demos out there that they had recorded of his sort of jazz fusion stuff. And some of those demos got to a guy at Epic, some A&R guy there, and he asked David if he was interested in maybe, becoming a solo artist and doing that work. And he was like, yeah, I do. And he checked with Bruce first, but it was like he was going to get a chance to have his own career and make this music that, that he had written. And so I think Bruce was, well, I know Bruce was crushed when Davey left, but he knew, is like, of course you have to do that. There's no way you can't do that. It really altered the architecture of the band, and kind of knocked them on their heels for a month or two while they were getting it, um, figuring out who the new guys were going to be and what they were going to do, and all that stuff. But, and then they ended up getting Max and Roy and all that, and it changed Bruce's sound in the perfect way that it needed at that moment. But it was amicable. I mean, I think the guy came up to him. They had this big breakthrough show. The first couple shows they played at the Bottom Line in the summer of '74, a year before the Born to Run shows. And it was like awesome. They felt like they were really breaking through. And like the next day, Davey goes, "Hey, guess what? That was great, wasn't it? Well, guess what? I think I'm going to have to leave." And so that was frustrating, but Bruce, never was propose, would never have wanted Davey to stay under those circumstances.
Question in the chat from Eric. Of course, we lost your fellow Springsteen biographer, Dave Marsh, this week. Any comments to share on Dave's legacy?
Oh my God. Yeah, no, it's huge. Thank you for asking that question, because I did really want to say something. That first Born to Run book, Dave's biography, came out when I was, I think, a sophomore in high school, and it was just utterly, it just completely swiveled my head around. I mean, it was right at the time when I had gotten Darkness when that came out, and then I saw the tour that fall. And of course, it's like people say, "Oh, Bruce Springsteen shows are life-changing events," and blah, 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 blah. And most of the time I'm like, yeah, sure, except for when it happened to me. So that really altered my sense of what a concert could be and what an artist could be and what a performance was like. And then Dave's book came out like a couple weeks later, and I got that, and I can't tell you how many hours I spent just like staring at the photos and reading it over and over and over again. And then his work in Rolling Stone. And then, unbelievably, in the '90s, I sent him just like a fan letter. And of course, he wrote back, because he was that kind of a guy. And like 10 or 12 years later, when I was a real, by that point, a professional writer doing this type of work, I got back in touch with him. And, or maybe he got in touch with me because he saw the Brian Wilson book that I did that came out in 2006. And he was hugely complimentary, which, blew me away, and then asked me to be on his show on I think the E Street Radio show, and to talk about that book. And then he just became like immensely important to me as a as a mentor in some ways. And when I got the opportunity to write Bruce, the biography, I called him first and I said, "Listen, I've got this offer and I'm going to take it unless you're writing another book on Bruce." Because I just thought, what's the point, if Dave's got a whole other book coming? And he was like, "No, I'm not going to do another book. And I think you should do this one." And he was just, and he said, it was hugely important. He said, "Now you're going to ask me about access." And all I can say is, call, get in touch with his publicist, ask for the interview. The answer that you're going to get is no. But that's really, if you can, and it's a no if you need the answer today, but if you can wait, it's closer to a maybe. So and so go ahead and work on the book that you want to write. And at the end of the day, they'll either talk to you or they won't, but you'll still have the book that you wanted to write. And that was crucial, absolutely crucial. And that just set me on that particular path. So Dave's work as not just someone who wrote about Bruce's career, but also his impact on Bruce's career by introducing him to John Landau, dragging John to his first Springsteen show, and just everything that he's done over the years to be to support Bruce, to write about him and interpret him for the audience, and then just the work that he did not secretly, but behind the scenes, and being a mentor, not just to me, but to dozens and dozens of other writers. So Dave is obviously, I mean, and of course, I'm not even talking about the work he did at Cream magazine and the stuff in Rolling Stone. I mean, he's just a huge, huge figure, and it's a tremendous loss. And thank you for asking that.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Sure.
Peter, I know in your last book you actually spoke to Bruce about the book. Did you talk to Bruce this time before writing it?
Oh yeah. I had some really. I sat down with him on his birthday, on his 75th birthday. It was right after the show on the beach at Asbury Park, and we had been in touch just sort of via text and email, sort of if questions came up. So yeah, no, he was very, very involved.
Can I go?
Sure. Go ahead, John.
Okay. I see the Springsteen on Broadway playbill behind you, and I was very glad to see it. And if I'm not mistaken, he spoke about writing Born to Run and ending up living just a few miles from Freehold, and kind of tongue in cheek.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of struggle with Bruce as the narrator and Bruce as the character. He says, tramps like us, baby, we were born to run. Yet was he born to run? Did he run? Kind of the same thing with The Rising. He's got the line on his back and can't see in front of me. Yet, it's more of a character than him being there. Can you talk to me about Bruce the narrator and Bruce the character? Can we reconcile that?
Sure. Well, I mean, but look at Bruce. I mean, he's simultaneously the guy who hits the road, who leaves because he spends, how much of the last 50 plus years has he spent on the road, touring and going? I mean, and he lived out west for a few years, and then eventually he came back. But one of the things that Steve Van Zandt said that I thought was really interesting when we were talking about Born to Run is that he said all the work that Bruce put into in creating the character that he was on Born to Run. It's like the guy who leaves, right? And then he said the most radical and courageous thing that he did was come back 3 years later with Darkness and transform himself into the guy who stays. So it's the guy who is still who is at home and is connected with these people who are who are still in town because they didn't have the options that he had. So, the fact that he's living in Colts Neck, which is, a 10-minute drive from downtown Freehold, is, on the one hand, it's a very different community than the part of Freehold that he grew up in. But on the other hand, he still runs his errands in the same, on the same streets where he was a little kid. So, but in terms of the tension between, autobiographical writing and writing about, in the mouths of characters, as in The Rising. I mean, obviously, Bruce was not a firefighter, first responder running up the steps at the World Trade Center, but he understands. I think his ability to be empathic and to understand the lives and experiences of others is part of what makes him such a transcendent artist. And and a lot of artists do that. A lot of your great writers, not just in music, but in literature and elsewhere. I mean, part of the time you're describing your own experience, and part of the time you're channeling the voices of other people. And to some extent, even your understanding of other people's lives is filtered through your own experience. But it's not all journalism, and it's not all, just straight up autobiographical work.
Great. Hey, thanks for that answer.
You bet. Thanks for the question.
Michael Waldman, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. Peter, first of all, I really enjoyed your 2 books on Bruce.
Thank you.
Especially the biography. It was just so way more personal than anything else I had read. So really appreciated that. And it's clear that you're a fan. So I'm asking you not about Born to Run, because that, I was around in those days, and that was a state change.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, other than Nebraska and Born in the USA, is there another album that you think is worth a book? Is there an album that was, that was a state change, or something that had such a interesting backstory to it that would make you want to write about it?
Huh. I mean, in a way, I mean, I've always been a big Darkness fan because that's the one that I came in on. That was my first record of his that I actually bought and really focused on. And but on the other hand, I spent a lot of time on that in the biography, and I feel like that's kind of a told story. One of his records that I absolutely adore, really among my favorites of his throughout his whole career, is Western Stars, which I just think is such a spectacular piece of writing and recording, and he worked on it for so long, and I'm kind of setting it aside and everything, but he was already describing those songs to me and how they were going to sound and what the strings were going to be like when I was talking to him in 2011, and then that record didn't come out till 2019, I don't think. But I love that record, and I love the way that the characters on that album are almost like the grown-up versions, or the aged versions of the people whose stories fill darkness. And it's got the same setting in the Southwest and everything. I mean, just the idea of, here's Bruce, in his, later years, finding this new way to tell these stories about kind of the same people he's always, told stories about, only now he really sees them as older people who are living with the consequences of the decisions that they made back in the darkness days. So to me, there's a lot, just as a writer. I mean, I don't know if, my publisher or anyone's going to get as excited to do a Western Stars book as they were to do a Born to Run book, let alone, but to me, that's the idea of the aging, an artist who has been around and vital for decade after decade after decade. I'm working on it's really interesting because I'm working on a book now about Bob Dylan, and and Dylan, I mean, his last album, Rough and Rowdy Ways, was like spectacular, and and it was as powerful a record as he had made, and he made it, on the eve of his 80th birthday. And I think Bruce is clearly capable of doing that type of work, no matter how old he is. And so the idea of and going back and reading over these articles about Dylan, as I've been doing for the last few months, you see people saying like, "Oh my God, I can't believe Bob Dylan's going to turn 30. Like, how could he possibly still be an active musician?" And it's like, well, buckle up, because it's going to keep going. So to me, that's an interesting story.
Buy that book.
Oh, good. Well, that's one. Perfect. Thank you.
We are almost out of time. The last question is going to go to Miriam, who I see has her hands up.
Oh, hi. Thanks, Melissa. It's the same one I had in the chat, Peter. I think I have such an image of Bruce as so pure that I'm always a little surprised that he seems to have a lot of knowledge about criminals in his song. And I'm wondering if you know any of the inspiration for like Meeting Across the River or Jungleland. Like, did he?
No.
How did he come up with those stories?
Well, my guy's got a huge Jones for cinema noir, right? So he loves, and that world of desperados, and people who, if you think to Nebraska, the one line that comes up on two songs is, "I had debts no honest man could pay." And in a way, I think he understands how that feels just from the years of scuffling as an artist. All the stuff that he was, that you have to go through, and how far you have to push yourself, and all the, I think he just understands how it feels to live on the edge. And that's obviously, a very fertile place for, in his imagination. And I think just, having grown up as poor as his family was, and and knowing people like that and understanding, you get to a point where, the best you could do wasn't good enough. Then what happens? And sometimes people go over to the dark side. And I think that draw to the dark side is something that's always been compelling to him, at least intellectually, in concept, something, and definitely as rich territory to explore as a songwriter. But yeah, no, I don't think he was knocking over liquor stores in order to keep the band on the road.
Thank you.
Well, we are out of time. I do keep these to an hour to ensure we are respectful of our guests. But Peter, I want to leave the ball in your court. Any last comments? Anything we have not covered that you would like to share?
Lordy. Well, the book just came out in paperback, so there's that. Other than that, one of the things that's been fun about writing about Bruce is just the level of, he's so forthright, and he's so, once he sits down and focuses on stuff, he's really thorough and really thoughtful about what he has to say and how he wants to say it. And he's also he's also very open to just telling everyone else, like, tell this guy whatever he wants to know. Like, this is all your stories as well. And so so I get the opportunity in that world of really being able to, to get as much information as I can really stomach. And then it's my job to try to turn it into, something coherent on the page. And so I guess it's just, one of the things I heard before I met Bruce when I was working on the biography, and I wasn't certain if I was ever gonna meet him, I asked some old friend of his what Bruce was like. And this guy who had known him as a youngster and I think had worked with him, had said the most interesting thing. He said, and I basically said, what is Bruce like? And he said, he is exactly who you think he is, which is true. But it's like, but Bruce is incredibly complicated and incredibly aware of his complications and very flawed in ways that he finds compelling. And it is interesting. And he's come to understand himself, thanks to 37 years of therapy or whatever, along with everything else. He's just been he's just a very aware, self-aware person and a really interesting guy. And so to me, the great joy in doing this stuff is being able to, just as a writer, having access to someone who's done the work that he has done that I admire so much, but who is also willing to talk about the work and about himself in such really stark, honest ways. And sometimes in ways that are like engagingly like bullshit that then he sort of thinks about, but he kind of is, there's that tension between Bruce and the boss, who are in a way two different people. I mean, the boss is like the projection of the best possible Bruce that Bruce can imagine. But he's always a little in real time trying to figure out where that line runs. And being able to kind of watch that or be in the room when he's working his way through that is super engaging. And as a fan, it's like, but it's like, anyway, so I guess, I don't know, is that a point? Was that a thought? Was that something I should have said? But I guess the thing that I want to say is, it's just that there's so much, it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to write about Bruce like this, because it's like there's a lot of great stories, there's a lot of great stuff, and he's, once he gets going on something like that, he's very open to just like letting you go and do your job.
Well, that was a perfect conclusion, Peter. It's almost like you've done this before.
Once or twice. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, and I really appreciate everybody coming too.
That hour flew by. So everybody, if you have not yet, you've got to go get a copy of Tonight in Jungleland, The Making of Born to Run, now in paperback. And if you haven't, you also have to plan your visit to the center. We have those gorgeous exhibits that I was telling you about, and we have a lot of really, really exciting programming coming up. Tomorrow is our last free summer concert series. We've got a film series coming up, and lectures, and music, and more. So check it all out at springsteencenter.org. Thank you again, Peter. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a great night.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Thank you.